On Wednesday, April 26, 2006, a bright, beautiful, outgoing 18-year-old named Whitney Sarek began making her way across her campus towards her lecture hall where she had a class that morning. Whitney was a freshman at Taylor University, which is an evangelical Christian liberal arts college located in Upland, Indiana. Upland is a little town that sits about 2 miles east of Interstate 69 and is situated right between the two much larger cities of Indianapolis and Fort Wayne. As Whitney made her way along the pathway across campus and she passed by other throngs of students hustling to their own classes, she suddenly had a pang of anxiety as she realized the end of the school year was fast approaching. And while Whitney was definitely excited to head back home to rural Gaylord, Michigan, where she was from, to spend her summer vacation, she was also kind of bummed because she would have to say bye to all of her new friends in college that she wouldn't see again until after summer break in the fall when the next school year started. Whitney had made a ton of friends over the course of her freshman year, and by and large they were other freshmen like herself. But she did have a few friends that were upperclassmen, because early in Whitney's collegiate career, she had discovered that upperclassmen were just as friendly as freshmen, and they came with the bonus of lots of experience and expertise, and if you just asked them for guidance or advice, they'd be happy to give it to you. And so over the course of the school year, anytime Whitney had an opportunity to interact with or be around upperclassmen, she would take it, thinking, maybe I can learn something. And in fact, that morning, as Whitney was making her way across campus, she saw a sign that was asking for students to volunteer to the next day head out to this banquet hall to set up this big banquet for the school's new incoming president. And so when Whitney walked over to the table and asked the people what this was all about, she would learn that the majority of the people that had signed up to be volunteers so far were upperclassmen. And so as soon as she heard that, Whitney was quick to write her name down as well. The rest of the day would go completely as normal for Whitney. She would go to her classes, she would study, she would meet up with friends, and then eventually in the evening, she would make her way back to her dorm room where she would go to sleep. Little did she know, when she put her head down on the pillow that night, she was within 24 hours of her life changing in the most drastic way imaginable. The following morning, Whitney got up early, she took a shower, she brushed her teeth, and then she spent quite a while just staring at her wardrobe, debating which outfit she was going to wear, and then finally she chose the one she wanted and she got dressed. Whitney was not vain, but she knew the whole day would be spent around upperclassmen and university staff, and so she wanted to look her best. On her way towards her door to leave, Whitney would stop and look in her mirror one last time to make sure she looked okay, and in this fleeting moment, as she's looking herself up and down, she couldn't help but feel a justifiable sense of pride in this woman looking back at her. She had gotten into a great college, she had moved hundreds of miles from home and lived alone by herself for the first time, and her grades all year had been excellent. And so as Whitney's looking at herself, she thought to herself, you know what, I'm doing pretty good. Whitney's gaze would move from her reflection up to the clock on the wall, and she would see she was running late. And so she quickly grabbed her jacket, she threw it over her shoulder, and she went out the door. When Whitney arrived at the meeting spot in the parking lot nearby, she saw there was a group of what looked like students standing around a university van. And so Whitney walked up to them, and sure enough, this was the group of volunteers. It consisted of 7 other Taylor students, most of which were seniors, and 1 university staff member. And so Whitney didn't know any of them, and so she quickly introduced herself, everyone said hi, and then because Whitney was the last person they were waiting on, very quickly after she arrived, they were kind of ushered into the van, and then the van pulled out of the parking lot and began heading north towards Fort Wayne. Fort Wayne was where the banquet hall was. It was located about an hour north. At some point during this drive north, Whitney struck up a conversation with a 22-year-old senior named Laura Van Ryn, who was sitting right next to her. Whitney and Laura were total strangers, but they looked so similar physically. They were both tall, blonde, and very slim, that when they first got onto the van, one of the other volunteers actually asked them if they were related. But it wasn't just physical similarities that Laura and Whitney shared. Once they got to talking, Whitney would learn that Laura had also grown up in a small rural Michigan town. It was called Caledonia, and it was located only a couple of hours south of Gaylord, where Whitney had grown up. After the van finally arrived in Fort Wayne, the volunteers got out, they went inside of the banquet hall building, and for the next several hours, they set up tables and chairs, they put out silverware, they hung up decorations, and the whole time, Laura and Whitney just stayed close together, continuing their friendly banter. And then around 7 p.m., when the banquet hall was ready for the next day's ceremony, the volunteers decided their work was done, and so they left the banquet hall building, they piled back into the van, and began heading south back towards their campus. For the first few minutes of the ride, Laura and Whitney would just continue to chat with each other, but pretty quickly they, like the rest of the people in the volunteer group, just were tired from all the hard work of moving things around, and so they became quiet and began looking out the window, just kind of keeping to themselves. About 30 minutes later, when the van was within a couple of miles of their campus, Whitney would turn and look next to her at Laura just for a second, and right as she did, Laura would actually look up and look at Whitney. And so for a really quick second, they made eye contact, and so Whitney kind of awkwardly smiled at her. And as Laura was smiling back at Whitney, Whitney realized something very strange. There was this bright light on the side of Laura's face. And then seconds later, that bright light had grown, and the entire interior of the van was completely whited out. And then a second later, someone towards the front of the van yelled, "Oh my God, no!" And then the van went completely silent. Within minutes, dozens of 911 calls were coming in from motorists on I-69 saying that something terrible had happened. When first responders arrived on scene, they were braced for the worst, but even still, they were shocked at what they saw. Scattered all over the northbound and southbound lanes of I-69, not far from Taylor University, were all these huge chunks of jagged metal, there was glass everywhere, and there were bodies everywhere. That light that Whitney saw growing on Laura's face that suddenly filled the entirety of the van were the headlights of an 80,000-pound, fully loaded tractor-trailer truck driven by Robert Spencer. Robert was a truck driver, and he was traveling north on I-69 when he fell asleep at the wheel, at which point his truck veered off the road into the grassy median between the northbound side and the southbound side of I-69. His truck bounced up onto the southbound lane and crashed into Laura and Whitney's van, and when it did, the impact literally peeled off the side of their van and sent the van spinning. And so as the van is spinning, because of this huge opening in the side of it, the students inside were literally being violently thrown out of the van into traffic. When first responders finally actually began surveying the crash site, they would find Robert still in his truck, he was alive, but they would discover that of the 9 occupants inside of that van, 5 were deceased. A few hours later, in the early morning hours of April 27th, Whitney Sarik's family, back home in Gaylord, Michigan, woke up to the sound of a phone ringing. When one of Whitney's parents answered the phone, it was the Grant County coroner telling them their daughter had been in a terrible accident and she was deceased. At the same time, 3 hours south of Gaylord, Michigan, in Caledonia, Michigan, the Van Ryn family also was woken up in the middle of the night to a phone call, except the call they got was that their daughter Laura had been in that same crash, but she had survived, although she was in critical condition. In the days that followed, the Sarik family had Whitney's body transported to Gaylord, and then they began to plan for her funeral. A funeral that would have to be closed casket because of the extensive damage to Whitney's body. Meanwhile, Laura Van Ryn's family rushed to Parkview Hospital in Fort Wayne, and they would find their daughter bandaged head to toe with a neck brace on, laying in a hospital bed in a coma. Doctors would tell Laura's family that even though Laura was now stable, there was no way of knowing if she would ever come out of that coma. And even if she did, she had suffered a serious brain injury, which likely would impact her ability to function. And so knowing that at best this was going to be a very long road to recovery, Laura's family decided to move her from Fort Wayne back home to Michigan to a rehabilitation center in Grand Rapids that specialized in brain injury. And so while the Van Ryns were in the process of moving Laura back to Michigan, the Sariks were in the process of saying their final goodbyes to Whitney. On April 29th, so 3 days after the accident, the Sariks would hold a visitation in their hometown of Gaylord. A visitation is a time for friends and acquaintances to come together and pay respects and offer condolences to the people that the deceased have left behind. For Whitney's visitation, more than 1,400 people attended, which was nearly half of Gaylord's total population. The following day, on April 30th, Whitney was buried. At the same time, Laura's family, who had been taking turns keeping a 24-hour bedside vigil with Laura in the Grand Rapids facility, were given some incredible news. Based on brain scans, it looked very much like Laura would wake up from her coma, although there was no timeline. Over the next couple of weeks, Laura remained comatose, but her body would slowly begin to heal, and all signs seemed to be pointing towards her eventually making a recovery. And then on Tuesday, May 16th, so 20 days after the accident, Laura woke up from her coma. And amazingly, at first, it seemed like her brain was functioning the way it should be. The family could not believe their luck. This was a miracle. Over the next few days, Laura would slowly regain her strength to the point where she could move some limbs and she could sit up in her bed. And then as for her cognitive function, it seemed like she was making strides, but then she would do something that would make doctors and her family and everybody around her start to question if her brain really was okay. On Monday, May 22nd, so 1 week after Laura had woken up from her coma, she was sitting in her hospital bed with her physical therapist right next to her, and her family was in the room as well. And at some point, her physical therapist handed Laura a pencil, and then she put a pad of paper in front of her. And then the therapist told Laura to write a word down that was very specific. It was a word that Laura should know well, and a word that Laura should be able to spell. And so after Laura kind of gave a nod saying she understood the assignment, Laura took the pencil and very awkwardly and painstakingly wrote out a word. But when she was done and the therapist looked at what she had written, it was wrong. It didn't make any sense. And so she asked Laura to do it again. And so Laura, with even more determination, would try to write this word. And once again, she wrote the same word, the same incorrect word. And so it was at this point that the therapist and the onlooking family started to realize that, her injury to her brain might be more extensive than we thought. However, as everyone in that room would soon find out, that was not the case. There was something much, much bigger going on. Back on April 26th, just minutes after the car accident, first responders began moving about the crash site to figure out who was deceased and who was still alive. When they found Laura, she was barely clinging to life on the side of the road, and so they rushed over to her, they put her on a stretcher along with her purse, which contained her driver's license. They put that all together, they put her on an ambulance, and they sent her to the hospital. Once Laura arrived at the hospital, doctors would use her driver's license inside of her purse to identify her, and then they began wrapping her head to toe in bandages and casts. And when bandages began coming off over the following weeks, it was immediately obvious to everyone that this accident had significantly altered Laura's physical appearance, most notably her teeth. They almost looked like they had been shifted to one side in her mouth. However, to Laura's family, they didn't care how she looked. They only cared that she was still alive. But on Monday, May 22nd, when Laura was handed that piece of paper and a pencil, and she was told to write her name, she did not write L-A-U-R-A, Laura. She wrote W-H-I-T-N-E-Y, Whitney. It would turn out a colossal mistake was made, and nobody caught it until that moment. The woman sitting in the hospital bed with the pencil and paper was not 22-year-old Laura Van Ryn. The woman sitting in the hospital bed was 18-year-old Whitney Sarek. When Whitney was found on the side of the road clinging to life, the first responders thought the purse next to her was hers, and so they opened it up, they found a driver's license, they looked at it, and they looked at the victim on the ground, and they looked identical, and so they said, okay, this is Laura. And amazingly, Whitney's purse that contained her driver's license happened to land on the ground next to Laura's body. And so Laura was misidentified as Whitney Sarek. A week after Whitney had written her name down on that pad of paper, it was officially confirmed that this was a case of mistaken identity. And so once again, the Sarek family received a call in the middle of the night from the Grant County coroner. Except this time, they were telling them that your daughter did not die in that car accident. She's alive. She's in Grand Rapids waiting for you." And so the Sarek family, they were completely shocked. They wanted this to be true, but it just seemed too good to be true. They had had a funeral for Whitney. They had buried Whitney. Except, because it was closed casket, they never saw Whitney. And so the Sareks hopped in a plane, they flew to Grand Rapids, and they walked into that hospital room, and there on the hospital bed was their daughter Whitney with her arms outstretched, crying, calling for her parents. While this, of course, was a miracle for the Sareks, it was at the same time a complete nightmare for the Van Rins. They had had their suspicions that something was off about their daughter, most notably her teeth, because they just didn't look like their daughter's teeth. But they had been told by the doctors and by anybody who would talk to them that it was perfectly normal for people involved in these very significant accidents to look completely different or even act completely different. And so the Van Rins just kind of put their suspicions to the side and focused on looking after their child and helping her recover. A few days later, Laura Van Rin's body, which had been buried in Gaylord, Michigan under the tombstone that said Whitney Sarek, was exhumed and her body was flown to Caledonia, where the Van Rin family was able to give their daughter a proper funeral and burial. Even though Whitney and Laura had only known each other very briefly during that volunteer event in Fort Wayne, their families would forge a bond over this shared trauma. And in 2008, 2 years after the crash, the Sareks and the Van Rins would co-author a book about their experience in going through this horrible event from each of their perspectives. That book is called Mistaken Identity: Two Families, One Survivor, Unwavering Hope. Also that year, on April 26th, so the second anniversary of the accident, Taylor University would dedicate a prayer chapel to the 5 victims. Since the crash, Indiana has changed their state's protocols and procedures for identifying accident victims to ensure this type of mix-up can never happen again. As for Robert Spencer, the truck driver who caused the fatal accident, he would be sentenced to 4 years in prison. Our next story is called Random. In 2019, Meg Maurer was a 21-year-old senior at Tulane University in New Orleans, Louisiana. She was studying ecology and evolutionary biology and planned to pursue a career in scientific illustration after graduation. This was a field that combined her skill as a scientist, her incredible artistic ability, and her general love of nature. But despite her intellectual brilliance, what Meg was actually known for was her very uplifting personality. When her mother was asked what her daughter was like, she said, "Well, it's like trying to describe what it's like to feel the warmth of the sun. There are not words to accurately describe what that feels like." And that was Meg. She was radiant, she was joyous, she was adventuresome, she was kind, she was really just a wonderful person to be around. In March of that year, just 2 months before their graduation, Meg and 2 of her close friends decided to go on a trip for spring break. This would be their last spring break as students, and they wanted to enjoy it. Because they were all in excellent physical condition, they decided they would spend the week hiking in Georgia. When Meg told her family about her big plans, they could tell she was extremely excited, and they just told her, be safe and we'll see you when you get back. On the morning of their departure, which was March 5th, Meg packed her suitcase into the trunk of her small green sedan, and then she drove over to her 2 friends' apartment building, and they came out and they put their suitcases into the car, and then once the car was all packed and all 3 of them were inside, they hit the road. The drive from Tulane University to this area in Georgia where they'd be hiking took about 8 hours if you didn't stop. But none of them were in a particularly big rush, and so they figured they would just stop along the way, and if they got to Georgia super late at night, so be it. After being on the road for 2 hours without stopping, they all needed to use the bathroom, and so Meg decided to pull over at the first rest stop she saw. And the first one she saw was in this residential town in Mississippi called Gaucher. So she pulls off the highway into this very nondescript rest stop, and all 3 of them get out. They go into the main building and they use the restroom. Meg was the first one to be done, so she came outside and she waited right near the bathroom door. And then her 2 friends, they finished up as well. They came out, and then the trio began walking back towards the parking lot where Meg's car was. At the same time, a man driving an 18-wheeler tractor-trailer truck was bombing down the highway right outside of this rest stop, and right before he was going to pass the area where this rest stop was, he heard something fall off the back of his truck. He instinctively checked both of his mirrors to see if maybe he could see what had fallen off, but he didn't see anything in the road, and so he just pulled over onto the shoulder and got out to see what was going on. When he walked towards the back of his truck, he expected to see, maybe one of the back doors had popped open or something like that. But even before he made it to the back of his truck and could even look at those back doors, he already knew what had fallen off the truck. 2 of his back tires were just gone. This truck had what's called dual rear wheels, which meant on the axle there was not just one wheel on each side. Instead, there were 2 wheels on each side, so 4 wheels across one axle. And so each of these 2 wheels were bolted together and would turn at the same time and kind of functioned like one big fat tire. This gave the truck more stability and safety when it was towing. The driver, in a panic, looked back down the road in the direction he had just come, hoping to just see the tires somewhere, but they weren't anywhere to be found. And so, not really knowing what to do, he just instinctively called his boss and told him what was going on, and his boss just said, "Hold tight, I will send help out to you." And so this driver is left to just stand on the side of the road and wait for help to arrive. And so as he's doing that, he's just staring back down the road in the direction he had just come, as if these tires are just going to magically appear. And as he's looking in this direction, he starts to notice on the other side of the highway, there are police cars and ambulances streaming into a rest stop that he had just passed. And it was the rest stop where Meg and her 2 friends had been. It would turn out when these 2 tires became dislodged from this truck, they went careening across the highway to the other side, across oncoming traffic, all the way up into this rest stop, and they crashed directly into Meg right as she was climbing back into her car. These 2 tires combined weighed almost 1,000 pounds, and so the impact killed Meg. She was pronounced dead on the scene. After an investigation, it was not conclusively determined what actually caused these tires to fall off. The likely cause was they were missing a small part known as a locking washer that costs $3 and is very easy to acquire. But regardless, at this point, the incident is considered a freak accident. The next and final story of today's episode is called Goosebumps. In 2006, a 20-year-old woman named Sarah started having some very strange dreams about a woman named Aurora. She had a very striking face with sharp features and long black hair. Now, her dreams varied. Sometimes Sarah was in a crowd of people, or she was at her office, or she was just alone in a room. But in all of her dreams, Aurora would always show up. Either she would interact with Aurora and they would speak, but Sarah could never remember what they actually spoke about, or Aurora would just be in the crowd or in the background just watching Sarah. Now, she had these dreams enough that eventually Sarah began to think, I must know someone named Aurora. I must have come across this person, and now they're just kind of manifesting in my brain at night when I'm sleeping. And so she began going through her older posts on social media to look in pictures of her and of her friends to see if there was a woman with striking features and long black hair that was this Aurora person in her dream. But after looking through hundreds and hundreds of pictures, she couldn't find any indication that she had met this person, at least not according to her social media. And so Sarah began just going on Google and typing in Aurora, long black hair, striking features. Has anybody dreamed about this? To see if there were people talking about having this type of dream on the internet. But she had no luck. Eventually, after about 3 or 4 months of having these strange dreams that Aurora was in, Aurora stopped showing up in Sarah's dreams. It was like it suddenly was all over. And so very quickly, Sarah just kind of forgot about it. A few years later, on Halloween night 2009, Sarah and a friend pulled off the highway into a gas station. They had been out with some friends celebrating Halloween, and now they were making their way back home. Sarah pulled into an empty spot right in front of the convenience store, and after they were parked, Sarah and her friend got out, they went inside, they got some snacks and drinks, and then they came back outside and climbed back into Sarah's car. A A few moments later, Sarah had turned her car on, she had backed out, and she had driven past all of the gas station pumps, and she was making her way towards the single-lane strip of road that merged out onto the highway. It was how anybody who got into this gas station got back out onto the highway. And so as she's getting closer to the entrance of this short merge road, her phone suddenly rings. What happens next occurred over a span of just a few seconds, so it might seem like this is over several minutes, but this all happened pretty much simultaneously. So she's pulling up to the entrance of this merge road, her cell phone rings, and because there was no one behind her, it was not a busy night, Sarah decides to just stop her car, put it in park so she can safely take this phone call. And so she stops her car pretty much right in front of the entrance to this merge road, and she picks up her phone, she looks at the number, and she doesn't recognize it, but she picks it up anyways, and she says, "Hello." There was silence on her phone, and as Sarah is saying, "Hello, is anybody there?" another car from the gas station pulls up right behind Sarah's car, and they start honking their horn immediately. They're in a huge rush. And so Sarah, who's totally embarrassed that she's blocking traffic, she hangs up the phone, she puts it down, she puts her car back in drive, and she hits the gas. But this driver behind her is apparently in such a rush, they're so impatient, that they actually swerved around her, driving on the dirt off to the side of the road just to get around her, and then they sped off down the merge road back onto the highway. And literally, seconds later, another car that was already on the highway, a silver Honda Civic, lost control and smashed into this car that had just passed Sarah's car. So there's this huge car accident literally right in front of Sarah and her friend, who have now stopped the car. They're right at the end of the merge road looking at this horrible accident that they narrowly escaped. Sarah put her car back in park, she picked up her phone, and she called the police. When the police showed up a few moments later, they took down Sarah and her friend's version of events, and then a little while later, after the ambulances had left and after the two cars had been pulled off of the highway, one of the police officers pulled Sarah aside and told her that the driver of the Honda Civic and the driver of the car that had swerved around her had both been killed in the accident. Shocked, the only thing Sarah could think to do was to call back that number she didn't recognize that had effectively stopped her from getting onto the highway and maybe even stopped her from being hit by that Honda Civic. And so she wanted to talk to this person and thank them for saving her life. But when she called the number back, the person did not pick up. However, it went to her voicemail, and it said, "Hi, you've reached Aurora. Leave your name and number after the beep." Sarah could not believe it. She said she had never felt goosebumps like that in her entire life. The next day, Sarah tried calling the number again, and this time the woman, Aurora, answered the phone. The two got to talking, and Sarah explained her crazy dreams and now this crazy car crash thing and how it's all connected. And Aurora would tell Sarah, like, "That's amazing. This is a crazy story you're telling me, except I didn't call you last night. I have no idea how you got my phone number." And so at the end of this phone call, the two women really had not reached any sort of explanation for how this came to be, how they came to be talking, but they ultimately just said, "Okay, hey, thanks and best of luck to you," and then they hung up. After the call was over, Sarah found herself just kind of sitting there, not really sure how to react to what had just happened. It was such a totally bizarre thing that she had just been through over the past 24 hours. And then if you include the dream, this has been a multi-year long thing. And so on a whim, Sarah just opens up her Facebook account and she plugs in Aurora's full name because Aurora had given her her full name on this phone call they had just had. And when she looked at her phone, when the results came in, Sarah nearly fainted. Right at the top of the results page was this woman, Aurora's Facebook account, and her profile picture showed her face. And when Sarah looked at her face, it was the exact same face she had seen so many times in her dreams. It was the same Aurora with the striking features and long black hair. The woman in her dreams was the woman who called her and saved her life. In 1938, a farmer in southeastern Australia decided to bring his horses to a watering hole on the other side of his large property. As he was leading the horses across this big, wide open field, one of his horses suddenly just collapsed to the ground. The farmer ran over to see what was going on, but as soon as he got over to it, the horse had stood back up again and seemed totally unhurt. The farmer was puzzled because he had no idea why the horse fell in the first place, and so he looked down to see if maybe it tripped on something, and he saw on the ground right beneath the horse was this small hole. And so he moved his horse out of the way, and then when he came back to look at this thing, he saw it was only maybe a foot across, but when he peered down into it, he saw it was very deep. And so he got down on his hands and knees to get a closer look, and when his eyes adjusted, he could not believe what he was seeing. 10 or 15 feet below the surface was this huge pool of clear water. The horse had just stepped into the roof of an underground cave. And so the farmer was really excited to see how big this cave was. And so he grabbed all his horses and he brought them back to the stable, and he got this long measuring rope with a weight at the end of it. So he runs back out to the hole, he puts the weight into the hole, and he begins paying out this rope. And so down it goes, 10 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet, it just keeps on going and going until finally the weight hits solid land at 120 feet. And so the farmer is like, wow, this is a huge cave. So he pulls it back up thinking that's the bottom, but in reality it wasn't. It actually extended down almost 300 additional feet. The farmer and his horse had just accidentally found one of the most beautiful and deadly freshwater caves in the world, called the Shaft. The reason it's called the Shaft is because the only way in or out of this underwater cave is through this hole in the middle of this field that this horse created, and it's literally a shaft that goes down 18 feet until it reaches the surface of this massive underground body of water. The opening to this shaft is so narrow that cave divers, they can't get into it with their gear on their backs. So they literally need to be lowered into this cave by themselves, and then their gear is lowered down after them, and they put it on while they're treading water. The solid ground that the farmer's weighted line had touched at 120 feet when he believed he had reached the bottom of the cave, what he had actually touched was the top of something called the rock pile. The rock pile is basically this huge underwater pyramid that looks like a rock pile that sits at the bottom in the middle of this huge underwater cave. And from the top of this rock pile, you can go down it in all different directions, but once you get to the bottom, there's only two tunnels to choose from. There's one that goes west, basically down at an angle that dead ends at 260 feet. And then on the other side of this underwater pyramid is the eastern tunnel, and that's much more treacherous. It goes down at a more steep angle to 400 feet. The few elite divers that have explored the deepest recesses of this cave say there are 3 distinct stages to it. Stage 1 is from the surface down to 120 feet, the top of the rock pile. During this stage, the diver swims unobstructed in beautiful clear water with sunlight poking through the hole. It's a very easy section of the cave. And there's a safety line that's anchored from the surface straight down to the top of the rock pile. So you have something to hold on to as you go down and back up. Stage 2 is where things get a bit dicey. Stage 2 begins at the top of the rock pile and extends down all the way to the bottom of the westerly tunnel at 260 feet where it dead ends, or down to the 200-foot mark of the easterly tunnel where you come to something called the drop-off ledge. And it's quite literally a ledge in the middle of this tunnel where beyond it there's a fairly steep drop-off, and it leads down to an area that's so treacherous it's got its own stage. Starting with stage 2 and then with stage 3, there is no safety line to guide you in the direction you need to go. So you're on your own as soon as you reach the top of the rock pile. And so you make your way down any direction you want down the rock pile until you reach either of these tunnels, and as soon as you go into them, you immediately start to lose visibility because the sunlight cannot penetrate all the way into these tunnels. And so the diver becomes increasingly reliant on their flashlight. As such, they have to be very careful as they navigate down stage 2 to not bump into the walls, because doing so will knock the limestone silt off of the walls. It will create a cloud of it in their face. It will blind them. It's like being in fog where a flashlight can't push through it. And so the diver has to either wait for the silt to clear, which could take a very long time, or they have to swim blind. Also, anyone entering stage 2 and stage 3, they can't breathe regular air out of their tanks. There's too much nitrogen in regular air. The deeper you dive, the more nitrogen your body will absorb, and if you have too much nitrogen in your system, it can give you something called nitrogen narcosis, which is like being really drunk. And in extreme cases, people have been known to take their mouthpiece out and inhale water, believing they're on the surface, or they'll confuse the direction up with the direction down, and to get to the surface, they will swim straight down until it's too late and they can't get back up again. And so divers that are going to be in stage 2 or stage 3 of this cave will breathe a special mix of gases that are low in nitrogen. The final stage of the shaft, stage 3, is just from the 200-foot mark of the easterly cave, so that drop-off ledge, all the way down to the bottom at 400 feet. This stage is unbelievably dangerous. As soon as you drop off that ledge, all the sunlight goes away. It is pitch black, and the tunnel narrows considerably and stays incredibly narrow. In fact, many times divers have to squeeze themselves past sections where the rocks are too close together. And so because you're inherently bumping into the walls all through stage 3, you're pretty much guaranteed to be silted out the entire time. At this depth, nitrogen narcosis is virtually guaranteed, even if you're breathing a special low nitrogen mix of gases. And so divers need to be ready to abort the dive at any moment if they feel symptoms coming on. Once the diver has turned around and is making their return trip, but they're still in the 3rd stage section of the cave, they need to be careful of false stones. These are offshoots on the ceiling only in this 3rd stage that look like the way out. And especially when things are silted out and it's dark, you're low on oxygen, you might be panicking, it'd be very easy to confuse these with the way out. But in fact, these false domes are exactly what their name implies. They are false. They are dead ends. They go nowhere. Stage 3 is reserved exclusively for extremely experienced cave divers who get special permission. In 1973, 8 divers got permission to dive the 1st and 2nd stages of the shaft cave. They did not get permission to dive the 3rd stage of the cave. On May 28th of that year, the 8 divers arrived in that big open field near the cave opening and began prepping their gear. Their plan was to dive down all the way to the edge of the drop-off ledge, so looking into the 3rd stage, and then once they got there, look around for a minute and then turn around and head back up to the surface. These 8 divers were experienced divers, but their experience was all in open water environments. None of them had dove in a cave. And so they were confident divers, but they were a little bit naive. They believed the dive down to the edge of the 3rd stage was going to be fairly routine and would just be simple and fun. But before any of them had even gotten into the water, they had already made a critical mistake. Instead of jamming their bottle with the special low nitrogen mixed gas that they would need since they were going into stage 2, and so that's a requirement, instead of doing that, they just jammed their bottles with regular air. So they were basically guaranteeing that they would get nitrogen narcosis. But once they had all their gear prepped, they made their way over to the entrance to the shaft, and one by one they were lowered down into the water and their gear would follow. And then once all of them were all jocked up, they grabbed the safety line and they began their descent. It only took about 2 minutes to get down to the top of the rock pile, and there they spent about 5 minutes taking pictures of each other before heading down the eastern tunnel. 3 of the divers were siblings, Glenn, Stephen, and Christine, who were 25, 22, and 19 respectively. And Glenn remembers after they made their way all the way down the eastern tunnel and they reached the drop-off ledge, he remembers seeing his sister, his brother, and all the other divers. Everyone seemed just fine. Everyone's just looking over this ledge. They're taking turns, kind of peering down into this black abyss that is stage 3. And then after 5 minutes or so, Glenn looked at his gauge and he saw his air was getting fairly low. Not emergency situation, but it was time to leave. And everybody else had the same amount of air as he did. And so everybody else was running low on air. And so Glenn was about to grab his sister, who was several feet right in front of him. She was still looking over the ledge down into stage 3. But when he reached out to grab her, she and all the other divers just suddenly jumped forward and dove straight down into the abyss out of sight. They dove into the stage 3 section. This was not something that Glenn was tracking anybody doing. This was not something anyone said they were going to do. This was not part of the dive. This was very dangerous and they weren't allowed to go down there. And so Glenn immediately swam down after them to try to grab his sister and stop her, or grab his brother, or grab any of them. But as soon as he went over that ledge, he saw it was totally pitch black and it was completely silted out from all these divers suddenly launching over the edge. And so Glenn knows he's not going to find them in the silt. It's also very dangerous for him alone to just dive down there. And so he figures, you know what, I'm sure they're fine. They probably planned this out and they're just going to go down a little ways and they'll come back up again. And so I'll just go to the rock pile and wait for them. And so Glenn turns around and he goes up back over the drop-off ledge. He makes his way to the rock pile and he just sits there facing the eastern tunnel, waiting for his brother, his sister, and the other divers to come back out again. But they don't. And finally, his air gauge gets so low that he literally has to go to the surface. And he's thinking to himself, if my air is this low, what are they doing down there? 24-year-old Larry Reynolds was one of the divers that went with Glenn's sister and brother and the other 2 divers into this forbidden 3rd stage section of the cave. Although he doesn't say this, it sounded like he and the others just wanted to go a little ways into this off-limits section, check it out, and then turn around and go back to the surface. And so Larry would say, as soon as they went over the ledge and they're in this 3rd stage, it went completely pitch black and the tunnel immediately constricted dramatically. And so as they're going down this very tight and pitch black tunnel, they reach a section that's so tight, they're down on their stomachs, literally pulling themselves through. And so after a few minutes of the group forcing themselves into this unbelievably dangerous place, it's like they all collectively realized, this is a terrible idea, we need to turn back. And so as they all began turning around, they realized their return trip just back up to the drop-off ledge, which was only maybe 25 feet, was completely silted out. And so Larry is in the back of this return trip line, and right in front of him is Christine. And so as soon as they all make their way into the silt, the only thing Larry can see with his flashlight is Christine's fins. And so he's staying right up on her and keeping his light on that fin to make sure he's going in the right direction. And so after only a few moments, Christine's fins just suddenly disappear. And so Larry's thinking, I don't know where she went, but I don't have enough time. I have almost no air. And so he just keeps on swimming, believing he's going the right way. And sure enough, he clears out of the silt and he goes up and back over the drop-off ledge, and he shines his light back up the eastern tunnel, back up towards the rock pile, expecting to see Christine and the other divers he was just with. But he's looking and there's no one there. There's no silt. It's totally clear. And there's not one diver in front of him. And so he looks at his gauge again and he's got a little bit of air, enough to maybe go down and make sure nobody is still down there. Because he's thinking, I don't think it's possible they could have swam all the way through this tunnel in this space of time. So he turns around, he goes back over the drop-off ledge, back into the silt, and as he's moving very slowly and cautiously, up ahead he sees flashlights moving around on the ceiling of the tunnel. And so he moves down towards this flashing light, and he realizes the light is coming from inside of a false dome right above him. And so he looks up, and he saw there was Christine and another man named Roberts, who was 28, frantically swimming around, shining their lights, looking for the way out, not realizing they're in this dead end. And so Larry was about to shine his light to get their attention when Larry's flashlight went out. And so now Larry is in complete darkness. He is completely silted out. He doesn't even know how much air he has left because he can't shine the light on it. And so he's starting to panic. He starts banging on his flashlight, and finally the light comes back on. And when it does, he shines it straight up again to try to shine it towards Christine and Roberts, but he had drifted farther down the tunnel. And so by the time he shined his light, he wasn't underneath the false dome. But when he shined his light in the other direction, he saw he was at the very far end of where the group had gone. And so farther down into stage 3 was clear. There was no silt. And so he shined his light down into the stage 3 tunnel, and way down the tunnel, barely visible, he sees there is one diver with his flashlight out swimming the wrong direction down into oblivion. His name was John, he was 20 years old, and he almost certainly had nitrogen narcosis. Larry knew he could not save him, and so Larry turned around and went back into the silt, back up in the direction of the rock pile, touching the ceiling, looking for that entrance into the false dome to try to help Christine and Roberts. But he's not finding it, and he's looking at his air gauge, and it's getting critically low, and he knows if he doesn't go soon, he's gonna die. And so at some point, after not finding the entrance to this false dome, he decides he just has to go out and save himself. And so he manages to get out of the silt. He goes up and over the drop-off ledge. He gets to the rock pile. He grabs the safety line and he fins himself up to the surface. And when he gets to the surface, he looks around and there's only 3 other divers up there, one of which is Glenn. And Glenn, he looks visibly panicked and he yells to Larry, "Hey, have you seen my brother and my sister? Have you seen the others? Are they coming up after you?" And Larry looks at him and just shakes his head. He didn't know what to say. He knew they were gone. But for Glenn, this was his baby brother, his baby sister. He had to go back down. And so with the little bit of air he had left, he put his mouthpiece in, he turned around and he dove straight down as fast as he could, staring towards the opening of the eastern tunnel, praying that his family members, that his friends are going to come out of there. But as he's swimming down and he's running out of air, no one was coming out of that tunnel. And so finally, when his air was basically empty, he had to turn around. And on that return trip back to the surface, he realized his siblings and his 2 friends were gone. It would take 11 months and 11 days to finally locate and recover all 4 of the bodies inside of the cave. John, the 20-year-old who Larry saw swimming in the wrong direction, was found fairly far down the eastern tunnel, laying on a rocky outcropping. Glenn's 22-year-old brother Stephen was found just 50 feet from the entrance of the shaft, but it's believed he died at a much lower depth and then floated up to that position. Glenn's 19-year-old sister, Christine, and the 28-year-old man, Roberts, that she was with inside of the false dome were found embracing each other just under the false dome inside of the tunnel. Investigators believe when they were in there, they couldn't find the exit and then realized that they had so little air that even if they found the exit, they would not get out in time. And so knowing they were just minutes away from death, they abandoned looking for the exit and instead just embraced each other while they died. And then afterwards, they floated down and out of the false dome. After this tragedy, the shaft was permanently closed to all divers, but years later, they would reopen it.